The sound of the water glass hitting the white linen was muffled, but the verbal assault that followed was deafening. Jasmine stood rigid, her palm tingling with suppressed fury, watching the red imprint of her brother's pain bloom instantly on the face of the kindest man she knew. Wait, that was wrong. The kindest man was George, who sat shaking. The man doing the assaulting was Henry, a high-powered corporate lawyer whose net worth demanded silence. Jasmine didn't care about the deals or the silence. She cared about George. George, who had been tragically blinded in a recent accident, was sitting at the table, struggling to find his footing in a world without light. Jasmine's heart was a drum of pure moral outrage. She had watched, simmering, as Henry had begun his cruel public assault. George, clumsy and disoriented, had fumbled the water glass. It hadn't shattered, but the sound of the liquid hitting the white linen was loud in the hushed environment of the Grand Summit restaurant. Henry had not offered help. He had leaned across the table and begun his scathing performance. "Honestly, Father, are you doing this on purpose?" Henry's voice, usually cold, was laced with public disdain. "You're a liability. You're ruining the table. If you can't manage a simple glass of water, how are you going to manage walking through a simple airport terminal?" George winced, his face, etched with the pain of his recent injury, crumpling further under the verbal assault. He was shaking, not from lack of vision, but from the brutal humiliation delivered by his own son. Jasmine, who had a blind brother, recognized the dynamic instantly. This was not tough love. This was toxic abuse disguised as instruction. She had tolerated too many weeks of seeing fragile dignity destroyed. "I asked you to move, Miss Walker." Prosecutor Hayes, the rival lawyer, hissed, annoyed at the interruption. Jasmine ignored her. She stepped right up to the table. Henry, focused on his father's cringing, didn't notice her until she moved. "He's an elderly man. He's your father." Jasmine's voice cracked with the moral fury she could no longer suppress. "You are torturing him in public. Why don't you have the decency to help him instead of mocking his condition?" Henry looked at her, his eyes narrow slits of icy fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about, you pathetic servant. You are fired. Get out." Jasmine knew the word meant losing her rent money, losing her livelihood. But the image of George's pain, the pain her own brother felt when the world showed him indifference, was stronger than the threat. That's when she struck. The sound of her palm connecting with Henry's cheek was sickeningly loud, silencing the entire, opulent restaurant instantly. "That," Jasmine declared, her chest heaving, "is for the man you're supposed to love." Henry staggered back, one hand flying in his face, his jaw slack with absolute shock. For the first time in his life, he had lost control of a room, and the cost was physical and public. The prosecutor immediately shrieked for security. Patrons gasped. The scandal was immediate. But then George did something unexpected. The old man reached out, his blind hands groping for the edge of the table. He found it. Then slowly, with immense effort, he found Jasmine's hand. George didn't flinch or look scared. He gripped her hand tightly, and his face broke into a small, profound, unexpected smile. "Thank you," George whispered, his voice steady. He then signed quickly and clearly on the back of her hand. He did it again. Jasmine froze, feeling the language on her skin. She knew basic ASL from her brother. He did it again. The crowd, focused on the dramatic slap, missed the silent exchange. They missed the smile. They missed the fact that George was communicating with her not through pity, but through code. Security rushed forward, grabbing Jasmine. Henry finally found his voice, shaking with rage. "You will regret this. You will be arrested." But George still held her hand. He signed one more message on her palm, his smile unwavering. "You passed the test. Don't worry." Jasmine was hauled away, confused, terrified, but holding on to the impossible warmth of that blind man's smile and the complex secret whispered silently on her skin. Jasmine was released on bail hours later, her head spinning. She had lost her job, assaulted a powerful man, and risked everything, only to realize the victim had been performing a test. "You passed the test." She immediately called her brother, whose knowledge of sign language in public events was crucial. Her brother confirmed the key. George was famous for his eccentric, high-stakes training methods, which he occasionally ran on himself and his family. The harsh treatment wasn't abuse. It was a brutal form of exposure therapy designed to prepare George for a life of public mockery. Jasmine felt the crushing weight of her own mistake. Her moral courage was sound, but her execution was catastrophic. She was prepared to hide, but the next morning, she received a call. It wasn't from a police officer. It was from Henry's private number. "Jasmine, don't hang up." Henry's voice was tense, quiet, and entirely devoid of rage. "I want to talk. Alone. At my office. I owe you an explanation." Jasmine agreed, fueled by a mixture of residual anger and profound curiosity. She met Henry in his minimalist, glass-walled office. The bruise on his cheek was a stark purple shadow. "Before you say anything, Miss Walker," Henry began, his voice low, "I need to confirm something. My father said you understood the sign he made on your hand." "He did it again." "Yes, Mr. King. I learned basic ASL from my brother," Jasmine confirmed, her voice steady. "Then you know this was not abuse," Henry stated, his eyes locked on hers. "This was a training exercise. He needs to learn to cope with public judgment. My methods are harsh, but they work. You intervened in a critical medical exercise." Jasmine sat forward, her own moral compass refusing to bend. "With all due respect, Mr. King, your method is barbaric. It is designed to inflict maximum pain and public humiliation. Your methods may work for business, but they destroy the human spirit. Your father wasn't learning confidence. He was shaking with fear." Henry flinched. He stared at the bruise on his cheek, then at Jasmine. He realized his father had praised her moral clarity, her willingness to act on principle, but he hadn't defended Henry's method. "My father specifically praised your courage, Miss Walker," Henry admitted, his voice softening. "He said you prioritized his dignity over your livelihood. But my father is a harsh man. His methods are the only ones I know." Jasmine realized Henry was broken. He saw cruelty as the only effective tool. "Your father doesn't need cruelty, Mr. King," Jasmine said gently. "He needs trust. He needs communication. He needs to know he can drop a glass without being emotionally savaged by his own son. That's not training. That's emotional abuse." Henry finally looked away, defeat palpable. "I don't know any other way." Jasmine saw her path. "Then I refuse your apology, Mr. King, and I refuse the settlement check your assistant sent me. But I offer you a challenge. You're using the wrong language. You think the only way to help your father is to break him down. I know he needs to be built up. Your father doesn't need a public abuser. He needs a patient guide." The escalation was brilliant. She had turned his public failure into a mandatory, high-price course correction. Henry looked at the bruise on his cheek. "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing that you hire me," Jasmine said, her voice firm. "Not as a waitress, not as security, but as your communication and support consultant. I will teach you how to talk to your father without cruelty. I will teach you patience. I will teach you the language of compassion. And you will pay me triple my waitress salary for the instruction. If you refuse, I will leak the full story of your training methods to the press." The escalation was clear. She had turned his public failure into a mandatory, high-price course correction. Henry looked at the bruise on his cheek. "And what if I fire you again?" "You won't," Jasmine said simply, "because you know your method is failing. And you know that I am the only person who can help you fix your father and fix yourself." After a long, agonizing silence, Henry, the ruthless lawyer, nodded. "You win, Miss Walker. When do we start?" The next day, Jasmine Walker began her new job. The Grand Summit restaurant was replaced by Henry's sterile, massive private office, the same room where he orchestrated his deals. The initial lessons were torture for Henry. Jasmine was firm, demanding patience and introspection. "You need to feel the moment of failure," Jasmine instructed, forcing Henry to describe exactly how he felt when George dropped the glass. "You don't process it with anger, Henry. You process it with empathy. What if that was your son?" The exercise was excruciating. Henry was used to dominating, not yielding. His natural impulse was to solve, not sympathize. Jasmine taught him new phrases. Not legal phrases or financial terms, but human ones. I understand. I am here. We will try again. Henry struggled immensely with the simple phrase, I am sorry. Why can't you form the words, Henry? Because I am sorry means admitting failure. It means admitting I was wrong. Henry confessed, his voice thick with unspent emotion. I spent my life eliminating failure. My father taught me that weakness is fatal. Jasmine sat back. Your father taught you fear, Henry, not strength. True strength is accepting vulnerability. And that's the only way George will ever trust you again. The transformation was gradual. Jasmine didn't just teach communication. She taught Henry to see his father again. She organized outings, not as tests, but as shared experiences. She brought George to a public park, and Henry was instructed to simply describe the environment without judgment. Tell him the colors, Henry. Tell him the sound of the leaves. Not what he is doing wrong, but what the world looks like now. Henry, clumsy at first, began to describe the yellow of the leaves, the cool feel of the autumn air, the distant sound of children playing. He wasn't solving a problem. He was sharing a moment. The change was instantaneous. George began to relax. He started engaging, asking questions about the shade of the sky, the texture of the bench. The tension that had defined their relationship for months slowly began to dissipate. Jasmine then taught Henry the technique of tactile communication, gently guiding George's hand to objects, allowing him to feel the world without sight. One afternoon, George was trying to use a cane, but stumbled, falling heavily against a railing. Henry's immediate impulse was to shout, "Watch where you're going." But he stopped. He remembered Jasmine's lessons. He knelt, checking his father's arm. "Are you hurt, father? I'm right here. We'll try again when you're ready." George, expecting the usual scathing critique, paused. He reached for Henry's arm, and for the first time since the accident, he squeezed it firmly. "Thank you, Henry," George whispered. "I'm just tired." The moment was a profound breakthrough. Henry realized the warmth of genuine connection was infinitely more rewarding than the coldness of control. He looked at the bruise on his cheek, the physical evidence of Jasmine's moral slap, and understood it had been a necessary intervention. Jasmine had not just healed their communication, she had healed their family. The relationship between Henry and George was fully restored. Henry had learned that his father did not need a tyrant. He needed a son. Jasmine's contract was complete. She had transformed the ruthless, emotionally stunted lawyer into a compassionate, engaged man. "You changed everything, Miss Walker," Henry said, handing her a severance package, which she now reluctantly accepted, as it included a contract for a large charitable fund. "You taught me that my father didn't need my money or my power. He needed my presence. Your father taught you that even the most powerful men are just afraid," Jasmine replied, smiling. "But you chose the right path, Henry. You chose humility." Henry didn't just transform his personal life. He transformed his professional one, dedicated to teaching effective, compassionate communication techniques to families dealing with sensory loss. "You proved your expertise is invaluable, Jasmine," Henry explained. "You will train families to use sign language, tactile guidance, and, most importantly, empathy. You will build a system based on human dignity, not legal threats."